Hey, well, good morning and welcome to our Christ Baptist Church devotional. We're in the last bit of Esther. We've gone through Esther chapter 1 through 8, and you see me here with headphones on, and we're doing again our second Facebook Live transmission because we have some technical difficulties. Some hardware blew up this week, and so we're doing everything we can. Unfortunately, we are able to at least use this Facebook Live transmission to be able to do that. The headphones are to help you with your audio so that you can hear the best way possible on what we're doing. So we're recording on a little phone and it's going through and going out to you Facebook Live. And we'll be taking this devotional as well, and it will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel and our website, so you'll be able to access the recording there. But this is a way to be able to get it out to you today. We did record this actually yesterday, but again, our computer situation was not able to handle the recording, so we're going to do it again. Well, we're in Esther chapter 9 and 10. We'll do both today. We've got through Esther chapter 1 through 8, and you've seen just how God's hand of working for his people when he is not with his people, but he's definitely working behind the scenes. And we've seen how he took Esther to get her to become the queen of the Persian Empire, which went everywhere from India to Ethiopia. And with her and her cousin Mordecai together, they went through the most amazing journey where they saw the nation Israel almost be destroyed by Haman the Agagite, a vicious enemy of not just Mordecai, but of the whole Jewish people, because he came from the Amalekites, which we saw out of 1 Samuel 15. And so there was a point of just great despair where they were going to be annihilated, but by standing firm, just like Daniel stood firm in the lion's den, Esther stood firm there to stand before the king and plead for her people in a banquet that she had for her and Haman. And God's hand behind all of this to take Haman's own words, and that's what was used to destroy Haman, the one who was the enemy of the Jews. He wasn't destroyed by some lightning bolt from God. He was destroyed by his own words that showed that he actually is trying to destroy the queen who is with King Xerxes. And when Xerxes found out that Haman was actually going to try to destroy his queen, he was furious. And then Haman didn't know what to do, so he was just falling around at the queen's feet. And the king came in and just saw that you were really now attacking my wife. And so Haman was immediately taken to the gallows that he built for Mordecai. A whole turn of events that was a complete flip. Only God could have written this story. And if that would have been it, that would have been the end of it. But what we saw in chapter 8 is that Esther's not done. It's not about just killing Haman. It's about stopping the decree that had gone out that said on the 13th of the last month of the year, the month Adar, that's the Hebrew month, the last of those months, on the 13th, anybody could kill any Jew for any reason and to take their stuff. And Esther's saying, how do we get rid of this? And so they didn't know what to do. And so they got the king to write out, and actually Mordecai wrote out that all the Jews could defend themselves. And they had a right to defend themselves on the same day, on the 13th of the month Adar. And so they gave that edict out to be able to do that. And it caused what was called the dread of the Jews. The fear of Jews now was everywhere in the kingdom, because they knew that the king's wife, the queen, was a Jew, and the king was supporting the Jews. So the king is not behind this edict, where before everyone believed the king is the one who's saying, yes, you can kill all the Jews. So they'd naturally be for that because they want to be for the king. But now we see, no, the king is actually for the Jews. And the dread of the Jews had come on them, and we saw in the last verse, chapter 8, and many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. And so, what a turn of events that you just see. It's not just about getting justice by judging Haman. And it's not even about getting justice of saying, well, how do we stop this this decree that going out to destroy the Jews. It was about now having all the people in Persia want to become a Jew. That's how God turned this to that, but he's not done yet. He is not done yet. Well, let's get into it in Esther chapter 9. We'll just go through the verses and just get a sense of the history of what is happening here and see how much God really blesses. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, so the month is coming. It's now been about another 6 months, and here they are, and it's the last month of the year. On the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews, see, they're no longer just Persians, it's enemies of the Jews, hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. A complete turnabout of events. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. You see, that whole 6 months took place, and everyone was very afraid of the Jews, not just because there's a supernatural fear that took place. That, of course, did happen, but they also knew that the king was for them. And verse 3 really accentuates this. Look at verse 3. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Now it's the dread of Mordecai. It's not just the dread of the Jews, the dread of Mordecai. Especially here what we see is all of the main governors in all the regions from Ethiopia all the way to India were cheering for the Jews, helping the Jews, doing everything they can to see that the Jews would win. Well, that's got to be a pretty impressive thing. That's got to be very impactful. So, the day came, but everybody knew that the government was behind the Jews, not behind the people who could attack the Jews. So verse 4, indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. There he is. Mordecai is rising even more. See, God's not done yet. He's going to make Mordecai to where he actually is running the kingdom, just like Joseph ran the kingdom of Egypt when he was in Egypt under Pharaoh. So, Mordecai was great in the king's house. His fame spread, and he became greater and greater. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And then we have listed here the 10 names of Haman's sons. Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adaliah, Aridatha, Parmeshta, Arisai, Aride, and Vezatha. The 10 sons of Haman were there, the Jews' enemy. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy. Notice how the author is now bringing out Mordecai the Jew, Haman the Jews' enemy. But look at this little phrase here, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So they killed their enemies, the people who tried to kill them, but they didn't take any of their belongings. They didn't take their stuff. And we're going to see this repeated 3 times. We'll see this, and I'm going to answer after we read these to explain why. Many people don't understand why they didn't touch the plunder, and I'm going to show you why. Well, we know that 500 men were killed right there in the city of Susa. And so that was Esther and the king were. Verse 11, on that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa were reported to the king. So somebody came to the king and said, King, so far, 500 people have tried to kill the Jews, 500 people have died. So the king, in verse 12, said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel of Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Boy, you take a look at this, and the king is sitting with Esther like in a sports box watching the affairs, and he's cheering for the Jews, saying, I wonder what else is going on. Do we have any other reports from the kingdom? What have they done in the rest? Now, what is your petition that shall be granted to you, even your further request that shall be done also? He's saying, I just want you to know that this is an exciting time, seeing how the Jews are prevailing. And so Esther then said, "If it pleases the king, let tomorrow be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." She said, "You know what? Let's carry this one more day in Susa. All the rest of the kingdom is fine, but right here in Susa, let's do this. Let's carry it out so we get one more day of protection." So verse 14, the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. So no doubt they were already dead, but they were just hanging there as a picture, a reminder to all the people, this is what happens when you go against the Jews. And this should just be a lesson right here, just for a brief moment, to say, don't be someone who's going to go against Israel, God's people. They need to be judged at times. They're being judged here in that they're under the king of the Persians. They were under the king of the Babylonians. Yeah, God is teaching them that it's much better to be under God than it is to be under these pagan kings. And he's teaching them. They're his children. He's teaching them. But he gets very upset when those people that he is using to teach them begin to abuse them. And like Haman, he'll take them and just wipe them clean from the face of the earth. Don't be the person who has hatred for God's people and Israel. Do not be that person, because now you're fighting God and you're going against the apple of his eye. So the king did what Esther wanted. The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. See, there's the second time. So in Susa, they first killed 500 men. Then they killed another 300 men here in verse 15, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. And this was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Oh, excuse me, that's verse 17. So we know that 800 men were killed as of verse 15. Now verse 16 says, "Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder." There it is. That's the third time. So in the rest of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, they killed 75,000 people who were trying to kill the Jews. But all of the Jews, nobody took their plunder. Nobody took the stuff of the people. Why didn't they do this? Well, let me show you why. In Genesis chapter 14, Abram went and he rescued his nephew Lot from captivity. When kings came and attacked the king of Sodom, where Lot was staying, and attacked them and took them all captive as slaves, Abram went and fought for him and released them. And Genesis 14, verses 22 to 24, the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, 'I've made Abram rich.' I'll take nothing except what the young men of Eden and the share of the men who went with me. Let these men take their share." So when Abraham left, the king of Sodom wanted to reward him and say, "Here, let me give you my stuff." And Abraham said, "I'm not taking anything from you. Otherwise, people would say, 'You helped make me rich.'" Well, what these Jews were saying was, "I'm not going to take anything from you. Otherwise, you'll say the Persians made me rich. You'll say that you delivered me. You helped pay for this." No, it was God who delivered us, and we want it to be only the God who actually prospers us. So they did not lay their hands on the plunder, because we want everybody to know that we get our prosperity from God. And verse 17 says, "This was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested, made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews in Susa now, where 800 men were killed, they assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day. Why? They were busy defending themselves on both the 13th and the 14th. And so they rested on the 15th, made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting, and sending portions of food to one another. It's not that just God gave judgment to Haman, but he also gave all of Haman's goods, his property, and everything. He gave that to Esther, who in turn gave it to Mordecai. So not only did he judge him, he actually took all of his stuff and he gave. That's a good thing. But then they had to deal with the decree, which not only is that decree not removed, it was turned to where the Jews can now. So that's a good thing. Yeah, but it wasn't just that. It was that the king and everybody else was cheering for the Jews, making this all happen. But if you said it ended there, it would be a wonderful story. But it's still not done. God's not done yet. This is how God blesses. Verse 20. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far. So Mordecai recorded everything. Verse 21, obliging them, get those words, obliging them, telling them you're obligated to celebrate the 14th day of the month Adar, the 15th day of the same month annually. Mordecai established a new feast from God. A new feast, a new celebration to take place of God's faithfulness. God said, this point of delivery is so big, I want you to understand, not only am I delivering you by judging Haman, by giving you his stuff, by turning the whole fear of defeat from the Jews into victory, causing all of the government to be on your side. Not only have I done that, but I've also issued a decree. There's a phone ringing. Yeah, here we go. Sorry about that. I also issued a decree that would say on those days that we're going to talk about is the Feast of Purim. And this feast was set up was because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make the days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. And so verses 22 and 20 through 24 tell us that Mordecai sent out a decree for everybody to be able to follow this feast because of these events. Now, verse 25 tells us, when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme with which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So, therefore, they call these days Purim after the name of Pur, which is the lot, to cast lots, to throw the lots. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard, what had happened to them. So, again, Mordecai wrote out and said, you're all going to celebrate because this event happened. And he's recounting this event here in verses 22 all the way down to verse 27. In reading 27, it says, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for the descendants, for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation, according to their appointed time annually. So basically, there's now a new festival, and verse 28, you can circle that verse in your Bible right there, that says, so these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or the memory fade from their descendants. How about that for God? He said, you're going to have a festival called Purim, and it's going to be on the 14th and the 15th of the last month of every Jewish year. And you're going to do it because of how God delivered his people through Esther and Mordecai, two very unknown Jewish people. One of them was an orphan. And it says these days will be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation. You know what this means? It means Jesus celebrated the Feast of Purim every year, especially when he was a child growing up. They celebrated the Feast of Purim, and it was a big event. And what goes on in the Feast of Purim is it begins first thing in the morning. They read the book of Esther. And when they read the book of Esther, the people all gather around in the synagogue and they hear the book of Esther. And anytime Haman's name gets mentioned or he begins to speak in the story, all the crowd shouts boo, and they start hissing and they start shouting because they want to drown out the name of Haman. Everybody runs around with little sticks that have a little rope on it, and Haman is hanging on there with Haman hanging on the gallows. They run around with the little Haman figures. They take effigies of Haman and burn him. They take a bunch of food. Everybody makes a bunch of food for the day, and they hand it out to the poor. So the poor people all get food, and they give gifts to each other, and then they gather the next night, and then they read the book of Esther again and go through the same ritual. They do this for 2 days. God says, you will do this and you will not forget it. Jesus actually did the Feast of Purim. It's that important. So God blesses to the place where he not only judges, turns things around, gets the government on your side, but then says, and we're going to have a feast that is now so that everybody remembers how God delivered Israel. We see now, just finishing up the chapter, Queen Esther, verse 29 says, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. So Mordecai, he sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim as their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for their times of fasting and lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. So between Esther the queen and Mordecai the Jew, they completely turned inside out the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians and set up a festival to be remembered forever. And we see this last tribute in chapter 10. King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land, meaning a tax, and all the coastlines of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and this is what the king of Persia did, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So Mordecai is listed in all of the documentation in the records of the kings of the Persians. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and a great among the Jews, and in favor with many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. And this is the one who refused to bow before Haman, the Agagite, who was an Amalekite, the enemy of the Jews. Here in the Persian kingdom, Haman was a man of full authority, but Mordecai said, I will not bow to you because of who you are. It almost cost him his life, but the king exalted him and made Haman actually march him around on the king's horse. He used Haman's own words to kill him. He put Mordecai in charge, had Mordecai write the edict that says now the Jews can kill everybody who wants to kill them. And he put Mordecai in charge of essentially the kingdom except for King Xerxes. That's how God blesses. And then he says, I want you to have a festival to remember this forever. You see, God blessed this faithfulness to this degree. This is why David wrote in a psalm that you're very familiar with, Psalm 23. David writes in verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You see, you're not going to just eat. You're going to eat and your enemies are going to watch you eat. And you're eating with the king. This says people who are to be judged are going to be judged severely. People who are going to be blessed are going to be blessed severely. God is a God of extremes. He's not a God of neutrality. He's not a God of vanilla flavoring. God is a God of extreme judgment or extreme blessing. This is what he does. Because not only does he prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies, he says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And that word follow is much better translated pursue. Pursue. Surely goodness and mercy will pursue me all the days of my life. God will chase us with his goodness. Sometimes it's a frightening place to be, as we saw from Daniel in the lion's den, a frightening place to be. With Esther before the king Xerxes, and her life is at risk when she petitions to say, would you come to my banquet and I'll tell you about Haman. And Mordecai, who refused to bow before Haman, who hated him and wanted to kill all the Jews, as Esther and Mordecai for 6 months had to watch whether her Jewish nation would be destroyed. God puts us in a place where it's sometimes pretty scary, but we have to keep remembering we're in the shadow of the Almighty. We're under his wings, and there we are. And we watch him deliver. And he prepares a banquet for us in the presence of our enemies. That's what God did for Esther and Mordecai. How's that for deliverance? That's amazing. Completely amazing. Well, that's Esther, going all the way from chapter 1 to chapter 10. A pretty exciting story. And now you know how we get the Feast of Purim. And I encourage you to go check it out, research it, look it up. It was on the March 19th and 20th of this year was the Feast of Purim. And all the Jews everywhere would celebrate that. They have kids come over. It's a big festival. Kids, they dress up in costumes. It's a big event. God, for Esther and Mordecai, created a feast to occur forever. And even Jesus himself would have celebrated Feast of Purim as well. So we see that in the book of Esther. An amazing story, amazing account, how a Jewish orphan girl came to be the queen, stood in the gap, emboldened by her cousin Mordecai, who really was the mastermind behind all of God's workings here, and he was elevated to actually run the kingdom. What an amazing story that happens. And it happened just a few decades after Daniel experienced his time in Babylon and the beginning of the Medes and the Persians. And so we see Daniel and we see Esther taking place, two huge kind of miraculous deliverances that took place, huge leaders, and now leading up to the actual bulk of the people going into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. We'll take a look at a summary of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, who come right after Esther's time. So about 20 years after Esther, we're going to see Ezra and Nehemiah come and see what happens there. And there's certainly some surprises that take place there as well. So we'll see you there when we come up with our next devotion. And I just ask your patience as we work through our technical difficulties, going through whether we're Facebook Live and how we do that. So we appreciate you being with us. Thank you.